principle to cope with various generations?
So yeah, really good question. And this is perhaps why it's such a double-edged sword to have had a real flippant moment of what was effectively a joke in Parliament where somebody was yelling at me, so I responded, and it then became this massive thing that I didn't have control over anymore. And that is a perfect indication of how when you occupy a space in the public sphere, people can have a concept of you, which is informed by headlines and social media and commentary, but then there's who you actually are. But those two things are not necessarily exactly the same thing. So one of my favorite ways to do things actually is to go and talk to people who think that they disagree with me. Because regularly what you find is that in those interpersonal relationships and discussions, you are able to work through and get to a point of understanding somebody's fundamental philosophy. And I very strongly believe that most human beings are capable of every single value set. So that is extreme selfishness, but it's also extreme empathy. And it simply comes down to the life experiences that somebody has been through, the relationships that they have with others, and the environments that they have been a part of, and how that begins to get into their head and the way that they think about the world. And we've begun to start to understand through contemporary psychology the ways that we have what are called cognitive biases, which is partially why our politics has become so polarized. People don't feel as though they can talk to each other anymore, and they get into their corners and they fight without really finding what their common or their middle ground is. And don't get me wrong, at times it's very oversimplified for somebody to caricature or characterize it like that, because, you know, what we're talking about in certain democracies or lack thereof in certain jurisdictions is pretty authoritarian regimes that are slowly eroding human rights or respect for people who fought for their space in society, like LGBTQI, like women, for example, like any form of minority. So all of those issues aside, the way that I seek to speak to people who come from different experiences is firstly to actually sit down and speak with them. Because what you realize is that you can't have conversations on Twitter in any meaningful way. You will just be back and forth yelling at each other and trying to own each other. You have to make that time in that space. And that obviously requires a dedication of energy. So you have to decide that you're going to expend that energy. But then it's about actually getting somebody to explain why they think the way that they do. And this is the interesting thing about a whole lot of contemporary research, in particularly cognitive biases that I was talking about before, is in 2020, most people have not had to articulate verbally why they think the way that they do. And what that means is people have a massive excuse to effectively create shortcuts inside of their brain and make assumptions about things that they don't have to step out rationally or logically. So I take it back to a lot of those first principles in terms of actually having a space that, with the privilege of my position, I'm able to take a lot of the heat and emotion out of in certain spaces, and I recognize my privilege in that, but also making that space in that time. And the other thing with regard to younger people and finding, I guess, their legitimacy, as you were asking about, in those spaces, is I think you have to realize that, you know, if the way that we have done politics over the past 100 plus years has been working, we wouldn't have the problems that we do right now. That's not an excuse to go and attack everybody who's done things the way that they are, but it is a requirement to participate in a constructive way and to bring different solutions to the fore. So I'm very much in favor of building a new house, not just burning down the one that we're in, because otherwise we don't have somewhere to move to. So my process of working through those things is always about trying to get people on side by having them realize that we have far more in common than we do in difference, but also that if life experience of older people is valuable, then life experience of younger people is also valuable, because we both grew up in different kinds of environments and circumstances. And that's empathy. Yeah, so there's a few different things to unpack in that. And I guess the first one is I have a job to implore people to look beyond the headline, because I think most people in the 21st century are pretty across the reality that a soundbite or a headline doesn't belie the entire story. And it's also been a real journey for me in the past 4 years that I've been involved in politics publicly, in that, you know, originally I had a whole lot of people making assumptions about the way that I looked, the way that I dressed, and everything from that point in time. And what I've come to realize through that experience over only the past 4 years is that people are more willing to give you the benefit of the doubt the more that you stick to your principles. But also it is an incredibly harsh, incredibly dehumanizing space to be in when you are effectively treated as a character. You're not treated as a human being. So you find that a lot of people, understandably, especially because you occupy such a position of privilege, they project onto you. They project their fears, their anxieties, and the very oversimplified versions of who we think people are. You know, to some people, I may look like the devil, and to some people, I may look like their version of what politics should be. And the reality is somewhere between those things. They think that it's always dangerous to create somebody in, you know, the worst possible version of themselves, because if that's the case, then you're never going to be able to actually work with them. And I guess to certain people's approaches to the world, maybe that works. But as far as putting people on pedestals, I also think that that's incredibly dangerous, because no one person ever changes the world alone. So for me, it's always about figuring out how to navigate this space. But I personally have always been very open about the fact that I have depression. So I struggle constantly with not only the day-to-day challenges of being a very public person, but also feeling as though I'm doing good enough at my job. And I had that before I was involved in politics. So I find solace, I guess. I find a sense of purpose in recognizing that I can't do this alone. So I build a team around me, and I constantly reflect with my community on whether we're doing things in the right direction, because I'm also invested in creating something that's bigger than any one person, because I want to leave this job one day, and I don't know if that's really soon. I don't know if that's a little bit in the future, but I know that I want to make sure that I have helped to support more people to be able to fill this role and fill many roles like it before I do that.